Hey Pittsburgh, it's Megan. Did you know City Cast Pittsburgh is part of a media collective run by Point Park University's Center for Media Innovation? The center is an incredible community resource, and they bring in great guest speakers. Next up is the Wall Street Journal's Jason Riley. He's a columnist and commentator and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute with a breadth of knowledge about politics, education, social inequality, and so much more. You can see him at the Pittsburgh Playhouse Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m. For tickets and more info, go to playhouse.pointpark.edu and use code WSJ for BOGO tickets. See you there. Here's what Pittsburgh is talking about. Native Americans have not been treated well by this country. Their land has been stolen, their treaties have been broken, and even their graves have been unearthed. The Carnegie Museum of Natural History has more than 700 Native remains and has only made 104 of them available to return to the tribes, despite an over 30-year-old law requiring museums to return them. Today, we hear why it's taking the Carnegie so long. It's Tuesday, March 14th. I'm Megan Harris, and this is City Cast Pittsburgh. So, Elizabeth, you brought this story to the team. How did you find out about what's happening at the Carnegie and all of these human remains?
Well, ProPublica, it's like an investigative news source. I'm sure you're familiar, but they released this bombshell database, which basically allows you to like search museums, colleges, institutions, like things that may have Native remains for Native remains in their collections. And you can basically see if they've had or made any effort to return those remains. Being a reporter, I searched up Carnegie, and the Museum of Natural History popped up really quickly. It's the 33rd largest collection of unrepatriated Native remains in the U.S. When I read that, I kind of had like a what moment, because I knew that there was this law in the books that like made it so that they had to return these remains.
And repatriation, just to make it clear, that means returning them, right? Like sending them home to a tribe or something like that?
Yeah, it's just fancy museum speak, basically, meaning like returning to the original peoples that the object or the body is from.
So what is the deal with this 30-year-old law then?
Yeah, so basically in 1990, this law came out and it's called the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It's a mouthful. And so I'm going to short it to NAGPRA. But basically it says that museums and institutions, they get like funding from the US government. So and that had like stolen or somehow acquired Native remains in their collection and other objects from that grave, they had to figure out which federally recognized tribes or nations they were descended to, and let the groups know so they could get their remains or objects back. The Carnegie Museum of Natural History has only made 104 of those remains or funerary objects available for return over they have 700 in their collection. So when you think about how much they still haven't made available in that time frame, it's a lot.
Yeah. How did the Carnegie even get all of those bodies or objects?
Yeah. So I spoke with Amy Covell-Murthy. She's the collections manager for archaeology and the head of section of anthropology. I'm just going to say that she is the person at the museum who is responsible for returning these remains. I think that's easier.
Yeah.
And she said that they got around 90% of their remains from what's called salvage archaeology, meaning someone was planning on building on top of a gravesite. And to quote unquote salvage the bodies and the objects that were buried, the museum kind of took them. That does mean that 10% of the bodies that might have come from looted or been purchased for the benefit of the museum. So while 90% were salvaged, there is the question of where that 10% came from.
Yeah, my brain was doing that math too. I guess it's not as bad as the grave robbing I was picturing, but if this law has been on the books then since 1990, more than you've been alive, almost as much as I have, why do they still have so many?
Yeah, I mean, you weren't the only one wondering that. After the ProPublica article came out, the museum got complaints from people like wondering why and assigning all sort of nefarious reasoning behind it. And they were right to be concerned, at least partially. A lot of museums try to get away with doing research on these human remains by purposefully not finding the nation or tribe to give the bodies back to.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Amy says that's like very, very terrible way to like exploit this law.
It's harmful when you realize that all of this research is being done on Black and brown bodies and institutions. We need to give these people agency in how they wish to have been buried. You can learn a lot from the human body thousands of years after we've passed. But I think that giving people agency and their burial wishes is more important than any of that research could possibly be.
Co-signed. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, truly, Amy told me that the museum actually doesn't do that, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. But their big issue is just the whole process of repatriation is just really long and really complicated.
I mean, I get that, but it's also been 3 decades. I mean, I don't know. I'm not totally sold. Am I being too harsh on them? Like, how long should this take? Does this take?
Yeah, I mean, like she told me that different processes take different amounts of time with different tribes and nations. There's actually one process that took 10 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I know. Yeah, I was able to get on a call with Carrie Wilson. She's the NAGPRA Director for the Quapaw Tribe, which was involved in that 10-year repatriation. The tribe is currently pretty far southwest of here in modern-day Oklahoma. The Quapaw remains that the Carnegie Museum of Natural History were there for almost 55 years.
And a note here for listeners, you sometimes hear people use the word ancestors. Carrie prefers the term human remains, so we're using that term instead. This tape is a little bit long, but it really does speak to the process.
Hi, Carrie. I just wanted to get you on the phone to talk about the repatriation the Quapaw Nation did with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. They had some human remains that were affiliated with the Quapaw, and returning it to you guys seemed like it was a pretty long process. I mean, what did that look like, and why did it take 10 years?
We did not have email back in those days, back before there were light bulbs and everything. But no, we didn't have email, we didn't have Zoom meetings, and we didn't have all the technology that we had. We didn't even have cell phones. Mm-hmm. And so, you start off slow, you send your letters, we get the letters, they go into the tribe. Sometimes they went into the abyss and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, the Quapaw Tribe got their office officially in 1994. So, and at that time, we were receiving lots of letters and everything from all over the United States, whether they had collections that pertain to the Quapaw or not. And as I have pointed out, the fact that the Quapaws, not many people have heard of the Quapaw Nation. We're a small tribe, and I always say we have an identity problem because in the history books in Arkansas, back even in the 70s, they were describing the Quapaw people as extinct. Mm-hmm. We deal with mainly archaeological collections, and they're all labeled Mississippian. It's not like I just get something across my desk and I can just look at that piece of paper and say, oh, yeah, that's Quapaw. It mm-hmm. takes a lot of research because I want to do the right thing. I don't want to repatriate things that belong to somebody else, that belong to another tribe. I don't want to do that. I want to be sure that it does pertain to the Quapaw people. Mm-hmm. Not all tribes think of NAGPRA as being as important as maybe I think of NAGPRA, and it's evolved. What's the tribe's priority? A lot of times the tribe's priority it's the living people. It's mm-hmm. the living tribal members. Do they have adequate housing? Do they have education? Do we have money for our education? Do we have money for our children's clothing? Do we have money to assist people that are in need? NAGPRA doesn't hit that top 10 list mm-hmm. because those are the needs of our contemporary living people.
How did, having that 10-year, process or time to get that, get those remains repatriated allow you to form a relationship with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History?
Well, I'm sure we've gone through different staff, and so things just took its own time. I sent the letters and I said we're culturally affiliated to these sites and went through everything. Amy was great. Amy Covell coming in and working with the Quapaws and bringing the remains back to us. And then I was chair of the cultural committee, and we were having a fall gathering, and she helped out with that event and went around and sold 50/50 tickets with me and just rolled up her sleeves and did whatever she could to be a part of that. And we certainly accepted that, and we very much appreciated it. So you can have good things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of doing the right thing and getting these remains back, on both sides. So it's not all evil. It's not all negative. There are special relationships that form when given the opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, once you got the human remains back, I can't imagine, what does it feel like to rebury them?
Well, you never can, put them all back together. And the thing about it is we're not talking about full skeletons. We're talking sometimes just a part of a leg bone or a jaw. We're not looking at full. So we're never able to really do that right thing. And to get them back is we take it very seriously, and it really, there again, it gets a life of its own. And it's we put them back to the ground to transition in that circular way that we look at life is, dust to dust.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put that back in there. All of the ceremonies and everything that was done for those people in their time, in the way and in the customs that they found appropriate. So we can't do that. We don't know that order. We don't know that. We could mess things up. So all we do is say we apologize that, this has happened to our past peoples. We are putting you back into the ground to return to Mother Earth as you should have.
Mm-hmm.
That's all we can do.
What an incredible process, and mental place you have to be to do this work day in and day out. Yeah,
Carrie actually referred to this as a calling, and a journey that she felt that she had to be on. And that journey is just that process is just one example of how complicated it can really get, and it's reflective to her specific perspective and Quapaw circumstances. Other tribes and nations have really different beliefs, and there are issues that come into play here, especially with regard to the 600 unaffiliated bodies that the Carnegie Museum of Natural History has.
And unaffiliated, I want to make sure I'm following. That means that the museum doesn't know then which nations or tribes these people belong to, or objects, or are there other issues that are coming into play here?
Yeah, unaffiliated just basically means that the museum hasn't identified a native tribe or nation to give the bodies back to.
Okay.
It's the first step of the repatriation process. And when you don't do this, you kind of have a legal loophole to do those terrible things with regard to research that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. I'm very glad to hear that that's not something we're doing, but this all still seems so squishy.
Yeah, I mean, they have so many unaffiliated remains, not for that reason, but because our region is has this issue with what to do with the Monongahela culture remains. That's a native group that lived here before European settlers colonized the area. We don't know if they actually called themselves Monongahela. That's what we call them. But they left these really impressive burial mound structures here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which you if you're from here, you might have seen or know of. Some of them were destroyed by development, and since there's no direct descendants for them to contact, their remains were really left in a limbo until around 2010, when NAGPRA was rewritten to allow for remains to be returned to geographically related native groups.
Oh, so if two native groups may have shared the same space or the same area, and one continues to this day, but maybe the other we know less about?
Yes, exactly. And since we have a lot of these tribes that have like lived in the same area, especially in our region at different times, it can get really sticky and complicated around who to repatriate these remains to. The other aspect that could have like contributed to the high number of like remains that are still at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History is the issue of transportation of the remains. Since the law doesn't really state who's responsible for the transport of the bodies, the museum used to have a policy that required that Native groups like come to the museum to get their remains and funerary objects.
You've got to be kidding me.
Yeah. Amy said that that's something that she's worked to change. And that's like a huge cost for, the tribes or nations.
It is. I mean, that's a huge financial burden, but it also, like, colonizers were the ones who caused this problem. And then the descendants of those colonizers say, yeah, if you want them back, you have to pay for it. What is that?
Yeah, no, it's a little bit crazy. I mean, luckily, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History isn't doing that anymore. And the tribe or nation might have more pressing issues. Like that was a point that Carrie raised. Getting to Pittsburgh to pick up to get these remains or funerary objects might not be the most pressing or feasible issue for the tribe or nation. But the museum is actually now doing the work to provide the transport to the native tribe or nation if that tribe or nation wants it.
I've never been great at sewing crafts, sorry Granny, but there's a resource here in Pittsburgh that makes all things sewing so much easier for beginners like me. Firecracker Fabrics is your friendly neighborhood sewing shop connected to Cut and Sew Studio in Morningside. Firecracker Fabrics specializes in mindfully sourced, small batch notions and natural fiber fabrics, even indie patterns and general tools, and you'll love their space. Firecracker Fabrics' mission is to foster a safe and inclusive environment for all shapes, genders, and ages, creating in the sewing world. You can shop their full inventory in-store or online at firecrackerfabrics.com. Or buy for your friends. They offer nationwide shipping and local pickup options. So stop in person, or check them out on Instagram for new products and easy-to-follow tutorials. That's at Firecracker Fabrics and firecrackerfabrics.com.
Last year, Harvey put more than $3 million into Pittsburgh's local economy. That's because the thousands of Harvey members who got boxes supporting small growers and producers. If you're wondering, how does Harvey work? Well, they partner with local farmers and producers so more of your dollars stay in local communities. You can customize what you want from their full catalog to build the perfect grocery box. Harvey does all of this with fewer carbon emissions by delivering to you and your neighbors at the same time each week. Fewer trips. Plus, they reduce waste by picking up your box, liner, and ice packs on the next delivery. Harvey is free to sign up, flexible, convenient, sustainable. Plus, they feature fresh, peak season food from small producers, including some of your favorite Pittsburgh producers. Join Harvey today to impact your community. Get $15 off of your first order with code CityCast15. The link is Eat Harvey, and that's HARVIE.com/CityCastPittsburgh.
So, okay, I guess this explains why we still have so many and why the process of getting them back can be so difficult. But what happens after that, when these remains do make it to something like a final resting place?
So it depends on the tribe or nation, and different groups have different beliefs around the best moves forward. But Amy actually referred to this last bit, the reburial, as the hardest part of the whole process.
One of the hardest parts of repatriation work is finding a safe place for reburial of the human remains and associated grave goods, which is the reason that we don't talk about it or advertise what we're doing when we're doing repatriation work. So not only do we not advertise it because it's what we should be doing, but also because, and I hate that I have to say this out loud, people will dig the human remains and burial goods back up in hopes to maybe sell them for a profit or morbid curiosity. So we don't advertise this work a lot for the safety of the human remains that we're reburying.
Yeah, I was thinking about that aspect, and it seems like such a re-traumatizing effect for the community whose remains have been taken once before and then taken again, to have to contend with. Yeah, that seems like an incredibly difficult situation. Has that happened for you guys in the past, or is that just a concern?
It's a major concern. Working in the museum, you start to realize things like way more people than you thought have human remains in their houses that they just collected when they were younger. I think was a disconnect at some point from these human remains actually being once living, breathing people, which they very much are.
I think that last part is so important to just keep in mind that these are not they're not all objects. They're people. They were people.
And it's really important to remember that their descendants and communities exist and thrive today, and that they have a right to take care of the people that came before them.
So zooming out a little bit, I guess, the Carnegie Museum has this enormous Native exhibition in its larger collection in their space over in Oakland. Does that include any of these remains? Is it appropriate to go there and participate, as Pittsburghers and consumers in that kind of a collection?
Yeah, so the remains aren't on display as far as I know.
Good.
And
thank you.
And I actually do think it's really important to go and see these objects. Amy Covell-Murthy has a really great working relationship with a lot of the nations and tribes whose objects we have. And, she works really hard, and so does the museum, to make sure those objects get the spiritual care that they, need under the beliefs. Like some objects they're supposed to take out so they can, be in the sun once a month. And the exhibition, actually, the current exhibition is Native led. So, how the objects are arranged, like the written like kind of cards to give you information are all written by like the Native community whose objects they are. So I really do think that the museum is doing what they doing the best that they can, and also reaching out to Native peoples to make sure that they get a say in how these objects are being presented and cared for, and that's really important. And it's an incredible exhibition. I hope all of you get to go too.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. I just want to express our incredible gratitude to the folks who did speak to CityCast for this story, on tape and off. It's through their generosity that we're able to share these stories.
Yeah, Carrie especially. She's the busiest person I have ever met.
And if you, dear listener, want to learn more about this, we really encourage you to do some more research. Elizabeth found a ton of great reporting about it, including some national journalism and a Federal Register. We've also talked to the Carnegie in the past about their own history with a very specific and really problematic piece of taxidermy still on display called Lion Attacking a Dromedary. We'll have a link to that in our show notes. It's all just a lot. But we encourage you to read up. We'll have those links in our show notes. Elizabeth, thank you again for looking into all of this and sharing it with City Cast Pittsburgh.
Thanks for giving me the space to do it.
A little more news before you go. The local airport is ditching its beloved people mover for our city's preferred infrastructure, a bridge. And they say it'll look like the view out of the Fort Pitt Tunnel. Pittsburgh International is planning to spend, I cannot believe I'm saying this, $1.4 billion on their new terminal, which is now set to open in 2025. Reminder, before they put up all those coming soon signs, they'd had up a bunch saying how great the older current terminal was. If you remember, that one cost $1 billion when it was built, and it just celebrated its 30th birthday. Speaking of celebrations,
of NCAA tournament appearances for the first time since 2013 and 2015. And the first
it's March Madness. That was the boys at Pitt cheering because they're headed to the tournament. And for the first time in over a decade, the University of Pittsburgh, Penn State, and West Virginia have all qualified for the NCAA tournament. Pitt will have to play in this week as part of the first four. If you're not familiar, that's college basketball's new-ish way of sneaking even more basketball into our lives. But if Pitt wins, they'll advance to the regular bracket. Meanwhile, West Virginia is ranked 9th in the South, and Penn State is ranked 10th in the Midwest. And if you remember your middle school math, it's Pi Day, March 14th. Check out today's newsletter for some fun ways to celebrate in the Burgh. That's all for today here on City Cast Pittsburgh. You did hear me right there. Even the NCAA thinks that Pitt and Penn State are in the Midwest. Shout out to sports writer Stephen Thompson for that tape. But if you disagree, well, boy, do we have a show for you later this week. Make sure you're signed up for that Hey Pittsburgh newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye-bye, y'all. How do we feel about a bye-bye? Bye-bye out of a Midwest reference felt right.